So today we're going to talk about the Earth and ecosystems. So we're going to take a really big step back from how we've been looking at life on the planet previously and talk about how Earth itself is a good habitat for life. And when we look across the whole planet, what are the reasons why we see different amounts of biodiversity, different types of plant communities, and what are the important characteristics that define those differences? So this is a lot to cover. So this lecture video is going to be divided into two parts. This is part one. We're going to talk about the Earth's climate and weather, and we're going to have a scenic tour of biomes, or major life regions of the planet. And we're going to come back in part two, and we're going to look at how the amount of photosynthesis that's happening in these different regions is contributing to the amount of energy that's flowing through ecosystems. So we're going to look at that really important transformations of energy and matter. And we're going to look at how matter moves through ecosystems as well. And it turns out that it's not only biology that's important, it's also chemistry and geology. So we're going to look at how molecules and atoms are going to move into and out of the bodies of living things, and for their lifetimes on the planet, how they move between these different compartments or reservoirs, places where we find these molecules. So we're looking at some really big picture stuff today, although this is some really interesting and exciting areas of research that people are currently working on. All right, so let's start by talking about our planet and our planet Earth. We're very fond of it. And the reason why it's so nice is that it turns out we have a temperature on the planet. It does range from below zero to up into, some pretty uncomfortable temperatures, but the vast majority of the planet is within a range of sustaining life during at least part of the year. And when we think about looking for other planets that might support life in the solar system, we often talk about the Goldilocks zone. What is not too big, what's not too small, what's just right. And the habitable zone, or planets, would need to share characteristics that they have a certain relationship between how far they are from the sun and how big the sun is. So the mass of the sun is going to determine how much energy it's putting out. If your sun is too large, then it's going to be too hot if you're too close to it. And then the distance from that sun. So if it's a smaller sun, you can be closer. If it's a larger sun, you can be further away. So this diagram is showing the kind of range, looking at these two variables of what that habitable zone is. So that's what we're looking for. Another thing that we're looking for is usually a lot of liquid water on the planet. We've already talked about how water is an important molecule that makes up the internal structures of our bodies. The cytoplasm of cells is mostly water. And so the fluid that moves stuff around, our living cells need to be able to be coated with water as well. So an external and internal environment. All right, so our sun is the right size, our planet's the right distance away from it. All right, so when we look at something else that's important about our planet is that it has a certain mass. And we think about big planets versus small planets. A planet has to be large enough that it has a large enough force of gravity that it can attract an atmosphere. So the gas that's floating around the surface of the planet, we have to have a large enough planet that we have strong enough force of gravity to hold an atmosphere around it so that we can have those gases for photosynthesis and respiration. Another component of our planet is that it has a molten region of the internal structure. It does have a solid core at the very middle, but the most of the volume of the planet is actually this liquid that's moving and swirling inside the surface of it. And because it's moving in some way, and because those molecules are electrically charged, we end up with the flow of the magma inside the planet, creating the same situation you have in a solenoid, where you've talked about those in physics, that we have this movement of a charged liquid, and it creates an electric field. So the planet has an electromagnetic field around it, and we think of that as generating the reason that we have a magnetic pole, a magnetic north, is that the electromagnetic field of the Earth is sort of sticking out one direction of the planet and curves around and sort of enters. So we imagine it like a battery, that we have a negative end and a positive end. So an interesting thing that happens to the planet periodically is that as the liquid inside the Earth is swirling around, it's swirling the same direction more or less for a long period of time, but gradually it shifts a little bit and then kind of suddenly will start to swirl in a different direction. And that's going to cause a magnetic pole reversal, right? So we see these in the geologic record. We look at the formation of ocean floor plate, and we see there's an alternating polarity of the molecules that are embedded in that and recorded as a historic document. It's highly variable when these switches have happened, and that they on average maybe happen about 450,000 years apart. It's possible we had one about 41,000 years ago. Maybe the last one was about 780,000 years ago. So it's highly variable, these intervals in between them. During the period of time the magnetic pole is switching, it will weaken, right? So where it's in the process of going from swirling like this to swirling like that, it slows down as it's doing that. So it may decrease to only about 5% of the strength that it has when it's normal. Now, what that's going to cause, weakening in the electromagnetic field, is a decrease in the ability of the magnetic field to deflect the sun's solar wind. So the sun is exploding basically all the time, and it's shooting out particles. And so this type of radiation coming from the sun, it's called the solar wind, is actually a flow of electrons and protons. So it's charged particles. And it's also called ionizing radiation. So when this ionizing radiation gets close to the planet, because it's charged particles, it's actually deflected by the electromagnetic field that's around the Earth. So what would happen if the electromagnetic field is weaker is that more of those charged particles would be impacting our atmosphere, and it would strip away, with the impact of those particles, it would actually knock molecules out of our atmosphere. So current scientific thinking is that even with a decrease in the amount of electromagnetic field power that we have in our Earth battery, that we would not be at risk of completely depleting the atmosphere and becoming a barren planet like Mars. Obviously, through the history of the planet, this has happened, and we haven't seen sort of this catastrophic, extinction events that go along with the magnetic pole switches. So, of things to worry about when you're in the middle of the night when you wake up, a pole reversal event apparently is not something that you need to worry about. Also, our sun is expected to live at least another 4.5 billion years. So we're about halfway through the life of our sun in terms of our planetary history. It's also going to start fading in energy rather than exploding. So we will have to, if we're still a species that's alive that long, we'll have to start seeking a new planet because the amount of energy will start to decrease, and it won't be enough to keep our planet warm. All right, so when we look around the planet, we already know, you knew before you came into this class, that when we look at, if we're standing on the ground, looking around us, when we're close to the equator in that tropical region, then we're likely to see a lot more plants, a lot more tall plants, a lot more green plants. And when we're in the Arctic regions towards the poles, we see lots of ice and snow, right? So part of the reason for that is that the Earth is a sphere. And so the sunlight that's coming into the Earth is perpendicular at the equator. So remember, the equator is 0 degrees latitude. And then as we get to higher latitudes, those are larger numbers. And we have 90 degrees north at the North Pole, 90 degrees south at the South Pole. When you shine a desk lamp and you put it so it's shining straight down onto your desk, it shows a round circle of light and the brightest light. If you tip it so it's angled to the side, what's going to happen, the same amount of light is coming out of the light bulb, but you're smearing that light across a larger area. And so when we get closer and closer to the poles, what's happening is that the light is striking the planet, not perpendicular, but at a steeper and steeper angle. So even if that latitude is in daylight for the same amount of time, the intensity of sunlight, or the number of photons per square meter, is going to be lower. So it gets lower and lower as it goes towards the different, towards the higher latitudes. All right, so just because the planet is a sphere, because the angle of incidence of sunlight coming into our higher latitudes means there is a decrease of intensity of sunlight. So that means if you're a plant, higher latitudes are going to give you less energy available for doing photosynthesis, right? And even warming of the soil and the atmosphere to create warmer temperatures during the day, more evaporation, more rainfall. The intensity of the sunlight also has an impact on those factors as well. But just the simplest thing is the closer you get to the poles, the lower the intensity of sunlight, right? So if you've ever traveled from a temperate zone and you're used to being outside, whatever, maybe you have a little tan or you don't need to worry about getting sunburn. If you go to a tropical destination, then you're going to get a sunburn if you don't put on sunscreen, because even though it doesn't seem like you're out any longer, the intensity of the sunlight is higher. So folks who live in those areas, especially ones with darker skin, are used to seeing those pale white tourists with their sunburns after they arrived in those tropical locations and didn't put on their sunscreen. So that's an uncomfortable and unpleasant situation to be in, but it's because your brain, you travel there fast enough that your brain doesn't connect that the sunlight intensity is higher. It's happened to me. I know better now. All right, so now we want to talk about if we're given any particular latitude on the planet, and we look across a whole year, do we see changes in the climate across the year, right? So we think about some places that may have basically the same temperature during most of the year, or places where we have, it's hot during the summer and it's cold and even snowy during the winter. So we have two different ideas when we're looking at this slide. One is sort of what's happening now on the planet, and why do we see different patterns of seasonal changes on different latitudes. Also, sorry, three things. Also, why we have different reversed patterns of the seasons in the northern hemisphere, the top half of the planet, versus the southern hemisphere, the bottom half of the planet. And also, when we're looking at this figure of the Earth's orbit around the sun, we can think about changes that have happened in climate on the planet over incredibly long periods of time. So the orbit of the Earth around the sun, now the sun is not shown to scale on this diagram, but the Earth's orbit around the sun is in the shape of an ellipse. It's actually much closer to a circle than this picture represents, right? So ellipses have two different directions out from the middle. They've got the long axis and they've got the short axis. So when we're looking at the history, the geologic history of the planet, we see periods of time where overall the climate on the planet was much cooler or warmer. Now, part of that is going to be due to things that are happening biologically on the planet, how much carbon is being, say, stored by tremendous amounts of phytoplankton with calcium carbonate shells that are dying and sinking and taking carbons out of the atmosphere and putting them into the deep sea. That could decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, for example. Also, it depends on where the plates are, how much plate tectonic activity is happening, how many volcanic eruptions are going on, and how big they are. Volcanic eruptions take carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases from underground and put them into the atmosphere. So these long-term geologic processes can lead to changes in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and changes in climate over long periods of time. But on top of whatever is happening on those cycles, we have slight changes in the orbit and slight changes in the tilt of the planet over long periods of time. So if we look at all the other planets in the solar system, each one is exerting a tiny amount of gravitational pull on the Earth. And so as all those other planets are moving around, they go through different patterns where they're pulling the planet a little bit, our planet Earth, out of its orbit. And those are predictable based on cool stuff, astrophysics, and that we have these slight changes in the shape of the Earth's orbit over long periods of time. These are actually called Milankovitch cycles, and that we can predict them, and that they're going to cause slight differences in how close the planet is to the sun and change the total amount of heating that the planet is having. Another thing that happens over long periods of time with the orbit is slight changes in the tilt, right? So notice that the planet's axis, if it was pointing straight up from perpendicular to the way it's spinning, right, that it isn't perpendicular and parallel to the sun itself. It's actually off kilter a little bit. We think this might be because when it got hit with a large piece of asteroid or something that actually knocked the moon off the planet, or some crazy story like that, that it tipped it. But it turns out there's a little bit of wobble in this amount of tilt, right? So the angle of tilt changes over long periods of time as well. And right now it's right about, I'm sure, 23.5 degrees. And it is going to be slightly different. And that's called the precession of the tilt. So there's a little wobble, and then there's this difference in the eccentricity of the orbit. So those are things that are going to cause the kinds of climate change that we observed as ice ages, right? So periodic ice ages in the history of the planet, those things are due to these small changes in the tilt and the orbit. Theoretically, we're due for another ice age about 50,000 years from now. global climate change may cancel that out. There's some scientists that think we should have had an ice age already by now, based on calculations, based on these changes in the orbit. So that is another area of scientific discussion. But we should move into a period of planetary cooling based on the change in the tilt and the change in the eccentricity of the orbits eventually. All right. So the other thing we want to look at is what's happening as the Earth is going around the sun. So it takes a year to go around the whole orbit. And so we think about the weather or the climate at any different latitude as having an annual cycle. And we tend to find, we can define these 4 parts of the trip around the sun as winter, spring, summer, or fall, or autumn. And if you're in the northern hemisphere, you're going to experience the winter time when the tilt of the planet is tilting away from the sun, right? So the northern hemisphere is kind of tipped away from the sun during a quarter of the Earth's rotation around the sun. And it's closer to the sun in the when it's along the shorter side of the axis. It's further from the sun when it's at the tip of the longer end of the axis. So those solstices are those at the ends of the major axis of the orbit, and the equinoxes are when we're at the tips of the minor axis of the elliptical orbit, right? So all of that stuff you learned in whatever geometry actually is important when we're talking about astrophysics or rocket science. So when the planet is closer to the sun, we have warmer parts of the season, but that also interacts with how much the planet is being tipped towards it. So the side of the sun, the side of the northern hemisphere is more tipped towards the sun than we have the northern hemisphere summer. At the same time, the southern hemisphere is being tipped away, right? So it's actually farther, sort of shaded from the sun during that same time. So we have opposite seasons in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. And the difference between summer and winter is more and more extreme as we go from the tropics or close to the equator to the poles. So if you have ever lived in a tropical location or have traveled there or have looked at the information about it, their temperature is going to stay close to the same year round. There's going to be a high amount of sunlight intensity compared to the temperate regions. And that as we go towards the poles, we go through this stretch of this sort of temperate habitat. Well, the temperate habitat, we're going to have a very strong seasonal signal. That is, it's going to be a big difference between summer and winter. And that when we get to the poles, we're going to have a very extreme difference between summer and winter. In fact, we can get up to high enough latitudes. It's dark for half the year and then light for half the year. So the day length is also changing, and that affects the amount of sunlight energy that's coming in, which affects the amount of photosynthesis that is able to be done at those latitudes. So we have a little complex interaction between the shape of the planet, the shape of the Earth's orbit, the distance from the sun, and the tilt of the planet, and whether the planet is tilted away or towards the sun, and then the latitude. All right, so we end up having this cycle of seasons that goes around the year that have different sunlight intensity and heat and rainfall because of that. based on the relationship between the Earth and the sun. And so really important in determining major overall weather patterns that we see in a particular location on the planet. All right. So the next topic I'm going to talk about, and I have an animation video linked in this unit for you because this is really hard to understand just looking at a static diagram. So I'm going to walk you through the steps, but then I'm going to ask you to also watch the video so that you get more of an idea of kind of in 3D and across the whole planet, what's happening. So it's somewhat hard to imagine, but we'll walk through it step by step. All right. So let's go back to a picture of the whole planet for one sec. When we look at the planet, we see that there's continents distributed around it, and that the vast majority, though, of the surface of the Earth is oceans. So there's a lot of water. And when we look especially around the equator, there's less continent there, and there's a lot of water there. So when we're looking at the equator, there's a lot of available moisture. Okay, so what's going to happen with all of this sunlight blasting down year-round onto these equatorial regions that have a lot of ocean around them? Well, what's going to happen when we heat the ocean is that water is going to evaporate from it. All right, so we're going to have warm, moist air. What does warm air do? It rises, right? So from your chemistry, from your physics classes, remember these sort of basic principles of what substances do when they are moving with respect to other substances, right? So dense things are going to fall, lighter things are going to rise, and we need to think about what's happening as this air moves away from the surface of the planet. So what's going to happen, we have heating at the equatorial regions where there's mostly oceans. So we're going to heat water up. It's going to form water vapor. That water vapor is going to be warm relative to the air around it. So it will rise, okay? So we have warm rising air at the equator. And warm air is capable of carrying more moisture than cold air is. It's basically like the air molecules are sort of juggling the water molecules. And when they're warm, they're juggling really fast and they can hold up a lot of water molecules at once. But when they start to cool off, they start, excuse me, they start to drop the water molecules. So what happens is that as that warm, moist air is rising, it's going to reach an elevation where it's going to start cooling again because the air around it is cooler as we go away from the surface of the planet. The air, as we sort of go towards outer space, the atmosphere is cooling. So the air that's rising, that is carrying this water with it, it's going to get to a certain height where it's going to cool enough that that water is going to fall back down as rain. Right? So we have warm, moist air rising. Now, if it moves sideways, it formed over an ocean, but if it moves a little sideways, as air masses do, then it may drop that rain onto nearby land masses, right? So a lot of rain falls back over the oceans, but we also have rainfall over tropical land areas due to the same effect. All right, so this air is going to dry out as it moves up away from the surface of the planet, and it's going to get to an equilibrium. It's going to get to a place where it has the same density as the air around it, right? But now it's going to be very dry and it's going to be cool. And so it gets to an equal density to the atmosphere around it. And instead of going up, it's going to start to go to the sides. And when I say to the sides, it's going to go north of the equator and also south of the equator. Because remember, this air is coming up from the equator. And when it gets to a certain height, it's going to separate in two directions. Like if you spray a hose at the wall, it's gonna hit it and it's gonna divert. It's gonna go in different directions. But imagine that the wall is the upper atmosphere that's cooler, and the air can't keep rising because it's as cool as the air around it. All right, so it's going to go to the north. It's also going to go to the south, but it's very cool and dry. All right, so what happens is it's going to go sideways until it gets to an area where it's now cooler than the air around it, and so it's going to start to fall, right? This happens at about 30 degrees north and 30 degrees south latitude. And what happens as it's falling is the same thing as spraying the hose towards the wall. As it falls and it comes back down towards the planet, it has to go somewhere. So it's going to go across the surface of the planet. And where does it go? Well, it's going to go back the way it came, right? Because we're going to have an area of air that's falling as it's pushing down, right? That's going to be an area of high pressure. High pressure, when we have a flow of air coming from the top down towards the surface of the planet, it's like pushing a spring down or pushing a piston down. That is going to force the air that's underneath it to move aside. Now, so we have a high pressure zone. And I want to come back to this area over the tropics, right? We have air that's moving up, all right? It's going to leave kind of a vacuum underneath it. It isn't completely a vacuum, but it's a lower density, right? So if most of the air is moving up, it's going to leave a lower density amount of atmosphere behind itself. And so we're going to have an area of low atmospheric pressure. All right, so low atmospheric pressure is when we have the air rising away from the surface of the planet. High atmospheric pressure happens when we have the air falling towards the surface of the planet. Okay, so we've got a high pressure over here and we've got a low pressure over there. So the air that's in between gets pushed or flows or falls down this density gradient. It's going to want to go from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Right, so this is going to generate surface winds, right? This air that's moving across the surface of the planet is going to generate winds, right? So what we have is water being picked up at the tropics, but mostly dropped back down onto them. But that doesn't mean that heat isn't being transferred in the atmosphere from the equator to the poles. That happens with water currents, right? So this loop, right, this circuit of air rising at the equator, going away from it, falling and coming back towards it, actually forms a tube that extends all the way around the planet that's kind of flowing in a circle. So we call these atmospheric cells, right? Cells like cells of the body, but they're cells of flow of air. When we think about flows of air, they act just like flows of water do, right? And if we want to study them, then we actually are going to use physics to study this moving air, this moving water. So the branch of science that includes atmospheric science is actually called physical oceanography. And often departments include both physical and oceanography and atmospheric science. So sometimes you might hear it referred to as meteorology. That is more of an old-fashioned term, but it's also, you know, what we call a weather person on the TV. They actually may have a degree in meteorology. But usually we call research scientists who are studying these movements of the atmosphere, we may call them atmospheric scientists now. And there may be a department of earth and atmospheric science, right? Okay, so we are looking at this particular atmospheric circulation cell. It's moving air, it's moving water, and it does it to about 30 degrees latitude. So when we look across the whole planet, it goes to 90 degrees latitude. So there's actually 3 of these atmospheric circulation cells, and they mesh together like gears. All right, this figure is only showing the very edge of the one that occurs between 30 degrees north and 60 degrees north. The polar cell is actually, it's much weaker than this equatorial one. And this equatorial one has a special name because of the scientist that first described it. And it is called the Hadley cell. All right, so this Hadley cell is this extremely strong and persistent movement of air rising at the equator, falling about 30 degrees north and flowing back. The polar cell is driven by a similar process, except the air is cooling and then it moves away from the pole and then it rises. Right? The cell in between them is basically generated by the fact that it's stuck in between these 2 other cells and that they mesh together like gears. Right? So the cell that's close to the equator in the northern hemisphere is going to go away from the equator and fall back down. The next one in the cycle is going to spin in the opposite direction. And then the one at the pole is going to spin the same direction as the Hadley cell. All right, so this region in between the cells is an area where we have separate air masses, right? It's called a front. And what ends up happening is that surface winds or lower atmospheric winds tend to run perpendicular to it. So if you know the idea of the jet stream is actually the band of wind that sort of is going in between where these 2 cells meet, the polar cell and the middle one. All right, and we'll look at that in another minute. I'm just going to check my notes and see if I said everything I was supposed to. All right, so when we think about how this is going to affect climate, we're going to have hot, rainy climate in the tropics because of this picking up and then dropping the water. We're going to have dry air falling in this 30 degree latitude region. And so those are going to be very dry. Arid means dry. And when we're looking at local weather, all right, so these are global or planetary circulations. When we look at local weather, there's all kinds of little things, little cells that sort of spin off and create little local weather patterns. When we look on the news forecast, if they say we're going to have a high, that means we're going to have sunny skies. And when we have a low pressure zone, that means we're going to have clouds and possibly rain, right? So we're going to have not only dry air in these regions, but we're going to have clear skies. We aren't going to have any shade from those clouds. So these are going to be hot regions. Okay, so those major atmospheric circulation cells, as the bottom of the cell is coming back and pushing its way across the surface of the planet, it's going to create winds, right? Now, because the planet is spinning, those winds are not going north and south, they're at an angle, right? So we're going to get these directional surface winds. And if you're studying oceanography, then you'll see that we have ones that are called the westerlies, and we also have the trade winds, and that those actually push on the surface of the ocean and combined with other factors create global oceanic circulation patterns. All right. So what we're going to describe as the Earth's climate engine is going to be atmospheric circulation. It's going to drive winds. And the winds are going to drive ocean currents. The pen is not wanting to write. Currents, things that move water. I'm going to give up on writing currents. Sorry about that. All right, so the word current is on the slide here. And ocean currents are major and persistent structures in the ocean. When I was first studying oceanography, I found it hard to imagine that there could be parts of the ocean that really were moving together and independent of other, you could have two pieces of the ocean next to one another that were doing different things. So they're so big though that and if their characteristics are different enough, those water masses will stay separate from one another. So imagine their temperature, their different salinities, so they have different densities. They will actually stay fairly separate from one another. So other things that are happening in the global ocean are that at the poles, because the water is freezing, what happens is that as water is freezing at the surface, the water part of it freezes and it squeezes the salt out. So if we have a salty solution, its freezing point is going to be lower than fresh waters, right? So it changes the freezing point. But what happens is the water wants to freeze, and so it actually dumps the salt out. It's cold enough to make that happen. And so the remaining water that's underneath the layers of ice is extra cold and it's extra salty. That means it's denser than the water around it. So these blue areas are deep water currents. They're cold, salty water that's denser. So it's flowing down to the bottom of the ocean, right? It flows down to the bottom of the ocean in the Arctic and the Antarctic. And then it moves across the ocean basins until it warms and mixes enough with less dense water that it starts to come up again to the surface. So we have these deep water currents, and then they change into surface water currents. And as they're rising up from the deep water, they're bringing nutrients with them. Because what happens in the ocean is that all the life that's living up in the ocean, when it dies, it falls down to the bottom. So if it falls down to the bottom in the deep ocean, it sits down there. It doesn't get up to the surface waters where the sunlight is. And so the phytoplankton can't use it. But where we have these regions where these cold deep waters are moving up to the surface, they're bringing those nutrients with them. So we find incredibly vibrant ecosystems in these upwelling areas. Right. The surface water currents are related to these westerlian trade winds that are pushing them across the ocean basins. And sort of what ends up happening is that we get circulation patterns in the northern hemisphere of gyres or currents that are sort of spinning around. And this one here, I can show you this one. Right, that we end up with water coming from the north towards Southern California. And if we look at this, if we look at this current, which my pen is not wanting to highlight for some reason, up there towards Alaska, darn it, that we have this circulation where it's bringing cold water that's been up in the Arctic, and it's coming down the coast of California, and then it heads back towards the equator. It doesn't typically cross the equator, but it circulates back around. It actually brings warm water to the opposite side of the ocean basin. Same thing happens in the Atlantic. We have water moving from the tropics in the Caribbean, moving up the coast of the eastern United States. And so if you go, it surprised me a lot, if you go to the beach in Southern California, the water is not actually all that warm. But the water's warmer on the east coast of the United States, the southeast especially, because that water is coming up from the equator. All right, so what happens is that, in fact, the entire oceans, all the oceans are interconnected with this global ocean conveyor belt, and that we have these persistent patterns of water movement. And this water movement redistributes heat from the equator towards the poles. So we have a more mild climate where we have this warm water coming up from the tropical regions in these currents. Okay, so the climate engine is important in understanding what are going to be changes that might happen if the planetary climate changes, right? So if we increase the amount of heat that's coming into the equator and warming up that water, how it moves into the atmosphere is going to cause repercussions into this entire climate engine. So when we think about systems, the entire climate of the planet is connected together in this system with the movement of air masses causing movement of water masses, and the water masses moving heat, right? So when we say that the atmosphere is increasing in temperature, that doesn't necessarily mean that the entire planet is going to, the surface of the planet is going to heat that amount of degrees evenly, right? What we're going to see is changes in the regions where particular patterns of climate events happen, right? So it's very, very complicated to try and predict what would happen to a very fine scale. And climate scientists have struggled with trying to explain that to the general public. I mean, we have barely scratched the surface of understanding the global climate engine in this one lecture. And you have had years of science classes already that is helping you understand it. And you probably still don't completely understand it, but you're probably at least to the point where you're like, wow, I see how that these things interact and how changing one thing is going to have a whole series of downstream consequences, right? So the idea of how climate is determined, right, at different latitudes is important, but it also is modified by the location of the continent relative to the ocean basin, right? Is it on the west side? Is it on the east side? Is it in the northern hemisphere? Is it in the southern hemisphere? And if that global ocean circulation changes, then the climate regions that are affected by the waters that are nearby them are going to change as well. All right, so what's the relationship between climate and weather? When we talk about climate is long-term average values, stable patterns that occur across large regions, right? Weather is more of a day-to-day observation of atmospheric phenomena. So we usually say, you know, climate is what happens over 100 years, weather is what happens over one day. So you may have seen these kinds of weather maps, and what they're showing is these areas of low pressure and areas of high pressure. And that's going to tell us whether it's going to be sunny, where the high pressure areas are, versus cloudy and possibly with snowfall or rain, depending on the temperature. And where we have these dotted lines, these are fronts. These are areas where different air masses are coming together. And we often get sort of scary weather where we have these fronts. Stuff is happening when these air masses bump together. So the jet stream is going to be this band of moving, like a river of air that typically is moving across around the the border between the US and Canada. but during the winter, it meanders further south. Now, when we think about a river in real life and we see a river and it cuts across the landscape, it's going to have these little wiggles in it. The same thing that happens with this river of air. And so sometimes when we have really cold, unusually cold conditions, even down here into Southern California, that happens when the jet stream takes a really big meander so that air that's coming from that polar cell is actually extending all the way down over our region instead of staying up where it's supposed to normally. All right, so these wiggles or these meanders in the jet stream are influencing the actual day-to-day weather across large areas of the country. All right, so I think that weather is fascinating. I wish I had taken more meteorology and atmospheric science courses. This is the tiny, like scratching the tiniest surface of understanding of all these phenomena. So I just want you to have an inkling, maybe an interest in these topics. As you explore further your interests, you might follow up on some of these effects of climate and weather. All right, so when we look across the whole planet, we're going to see that latitude is the most important thing determining climate, right? But we can see that along the same latitude, there are going to be differences in climate that are determined by things that are going on, say, at the scale of the land masses and ocean basins, right? We know that the climate in Southern California is more dry, and the climate over here on the East Coast of the United States at about the same latitude is going to be more humid and rainy in the summer. And that's because of where it is on this landmass relative to the oceans, right? So latitude isn't going to be the only thing determining climate. When we zoom in a little more, we're going to see that it's relative to the influence of nearby ocean basins as well. And then when we look across the landscape, local topography, right? Topography is the shape. So where we have a mountain range, right, the topography is three-dimensional. That can also influence climate. And we have here in San Diego the same interesting weather phenomenon, climate phenomenon that it occurs all around the globe. And where we have across the same latitude, right? So imagine the 8 freeway, and you're driving from Ocean Beach to Ansbarago Desert, right? Close to the ocean, you're going to have a moderate temperature that isn't going to change as much from day to night, right? You go inland, it's going to get hotter during the day, and you're going to have a bigger difference between daytime and nighttime temperature. You're going to go up into the mountains, you're going to have an even bigger difference in daytime and nighttime temperature and have an even more extreme difference between winter and summer weather. And when you get over the mountain range out into the desert, you have desert, which is hotter and drier year round. It can be very cold in the winter, but it's always dry. The reason that happens is because of the same idea of our warm, moist air rising, right? And what happens is that over the ocean, we get winds moving from the ocean onto land. And this air movement, because of the difference in temperature between the ocean, so at night, the temperature of the land is going to cool down, the temperature of the ocean is going to stay the same. And so air is going to warmer, moister air is going to flow from over the ocean towards over the land. So we're going to have this moist air moving from near the ocean inland. And when it gets to the mountain range, it has to go somewhere and it's going to go up, right? So this cooler moisture air, as it increases it goes inland, it's going to warm. And then as it gets pushed up, it's going to have the same thing happen to it. It increases in elevation enough that it cools to the point where it's going to drop its water that it's carrying as rain. So we're going to have it losing all of its water. And as the wind continues to flow inland over the mountains, when it gets to the other side, it's going to be dry, right? So it's almost as if the mountains have caught all the moisture that's coming at them from the ocean side. So we're going to say that the ocean side, the wind, the direction the wind is coming from, is going to be moving that moist air, is going to be the windward side. And the other side of the mountains is the leeward side. The lee is like the shadow, right? So what we have in any area of the planet that has this kind of pattern isn't always east-west. It can be north and south as well, depending on where you are, is we're going to have a rainy, wet side of the mountains and a dry side of the mountains. This is very pronounced in Hawaii. And so one of the common ways of talking about what side of the island you're from is whether you're on the windward or the leeward side. And the climate is quite different. It could be raining, you drive 30 feet, and if you've gotten across to the other side of the mountain, it isn't raining over there. All right, so this phenomenon is another way, right? This surface topography, this mountain range, is going to cause there to be different climate on the west side of those mountains versus the east side of the mountains, for example, right? So our three main drivers of climate, as we're zoomed all the way out, it's latitude. When we zoom in a little more, it's where the continent is relative to the ocean basin, depending on how the oceanic circulation is going. And then when we zoom in even more, we're going to have this surface topography that can modify climate even on the same latitude, right? Okay. All right. So we're going to transition here from this extremely sort of not biology seeming kind of information into a tour of the planet in terms of what are habitats. And we're going to talk about aquatic and marine habitats, and then we're going to talk about terrestrial or land-based habitats. And we call these biomes. Biomes. And biomes in the terrestrial environment are basically determined by looking around at the plants that you see. And so we're going to define the biome by characteristic plant communities. We're going to have forest versus grassland, for example. We can split it down into different variations or types. Now, marine and aquatic biomes are defined a little bit differently. When we think about what plants need in the environment, animals need in the environment, there needs to be a source of water, there needs to be a source of nutrients, and there needs to be sunlight so that photosynthesis can happen. Right? So when we look in the terrestrial environment, for the most part, there's soil, which is where we're going to find the nutrients, and the plants are growing in it. We may have poor soils versus rich soils in nutrients, but the soil's there. We're going to have sunlight because the plants are sticking up from the surface of the earth. We're going to have less sunlight as we go towards the poles. But when we look in the aquatic environment, so in the terrestrial environment, water is going to be the thing that is going to be limiting in some habitats and not limiting in others. A limiting factor is something that, you could have plenty of sunlight and nutrients, but if you don't have any water, your plant's going to die, right? So whatever's limiting is the thing that you're likely to have the least of. I like to think about doing my laundry, because I do my laundry when I run out of something, right? There's something you run out of first. For me, it's socks, right? So socks are my limiting factor in my wardrobe. Oh, why don't I buy more socks? Well, I've got this sock drawer and it's only so big and I don't want to expand my sock collection, right? So when I am running out of socks, it's time for me to do my laundry. So socks are my limiting factor. And in each of these types of ecosystems, there's going to be something that's the limiting factor. So in terrestrial ecosystems, it's water. Obviously, in aquatic systems, right, it's not going to be water because they're water. So what is it? Well, sunlight is only going to occur in the very surface of the oceans, right? As sunlight tries to penetrate down through the water, the wavelengths of light get stopped, right, or attenuated. They don't penetrate. Now, if the water is clear, they're going to go deeper, but there's definitely a depth, right, below which there is no sunlight. So we can't rely on photosynthesis to produce food for consumers to eat in those dark regions, right? So, but assuming we're in the surface water, what we need to have is nutrients. And like we were talking about how all the dead organisms and their poop and all the stuff, all their pee and all the things that might be used as nutrients, where do they go in deep water habitats? Well, they fall all the way to the bottom, down to where it's dark, and there isn't any organisms doing photosynthesis down there. So we tend to find the most photosynthesis happening, the most productive, the most complex, interesting, beautiful, fun areas to say go snorkeling or scuba diving in close to shore. So we have near shore habitats in shallow water. The nutrients can get into the water there. They're going to run down into the oceans from the rivers, right? So river runoff is going to bring nutrients and soil down from the terrestrial environment. And also where we have wave action, where we have storms, the water's fairly shallow, then those nutrients are going to get stirred up, right? So in the winter here in San Diego, we tend to see that the water's more clear in the summer. It gets more murky or cloudy in the winter when we have storms, and that sediment gets mixed up, the nutrients gets mixed up into the water. All right, so in tropical shallow seas, we typically find coral reefs, right? So they're complex ecosystems that rely on the photosynthesis of organisms that coexist with the corals. They're symbiotic zooxanthellae. And when we look in the terrestrial environment, we're going to look at lakes and lakes, rivers, marshes. And then when we have the open ocean environment, it's actually this vast, incredibly large habitat all the way around the world without much in it. So these shallow habitats that are near land, so they have more nutrients and that have often have this interaction with the terrestrial environment are going to be the most biodiverse. All right, so what matters in aquatic environments? Salinity, whether it's saltwater or freshwater. I'm trying to write salinity and my pen is malfunctioning. Temperature is also going to be important. Oxygen, if the water is fairly well mixed, it is going to have oxygen mixed into it from the surface, but down deeper in the water or where there's very stagnant water, there won't be any oxygen. So it'll be anoxic and eukaryotic life can't exist there. Sometimes we're going to have differences in pH, and then I'm going to put nutrients here. All right, so the most important other thing that's going to control the amount of sunlight that's available is going to be determined by latitude, and it's also going to be determined by depth, right? The deeper we go, the less sunlight. So these are factors that are important in marine and aquatic biomes. Quick tour of marine and aquatic biomes, right? So when we talk about a lake, it can be deep enough that we have this water that's deep enough that it's dark, right? Some ponds, lakes that are small, that's not going to happen. We're going to have a close to shore area and a deep water area. Where the water is too deep for photosynthesis to happen, we're going to call it the aphotic zone, no photosynthesis. The photic zone is where there's light, and that is where photosynthesis is happening. We have a photic zone and an aphotic zone in the oceans as well. And how deep the light penetrates depends on the amount of sediment that's mixed into the water. So when we look at the near shore zone versus the open ocean zone, these areas that are more shallow, close to the edge of the continent, we may find more biodiversity, more nutrients, whereas out in the benthic zone, very deep water, out in the oceanic regions, there's going to be very few nutrients and no light. Now, we may have special communities that exist in these deep ocean habitats. We've got a picture here of this hydrothermal vent, right? And we're going to have chemoautosynthetic bacteria that can live at these deep depths. So we don't have to rely entirely on photosynthesis from the surface in these deep ocean habitats. We can also have food webs that are based on bacteria that are able to do chemoautotrophy. All right, when we look at freshwater habitats, they're going to be characterized by whether they are still water or whether they are flowing water. And if you think about the word lens or lentil, the shape of that lens is actually like a little bowl. All right, so lentic habitats are little bowl-shaped still water ponds and lakes. If it's small, it's a pond. If it's big, if it's a lake. Lotic habitats are flowing water. Creeks, streams, and rivers, the higher they are up in mountains, the faster flowing, smaller and shallower they are. They tend to merge together, and then over flatter areas, they become more slowly flowing streams and then larger rivers, right? The study of freshwater habitats and the organisms that live in them is called limnology, L-I-M-N-ology, as opposed to oceanography, which is the study of oceans. We have another kind of habitat that are called wetlands, and wetlands are going to be areas where we don't typically have water flowing across. It's more standing, but it isn't as deep as a lake or a pond. And we call these floodplains, marshes, bogs, fens. They're places where they're going to be soggy during part of the year. They may have standing water. It's going to dry out or be drier during different parts of the year. So if you imagine the Amazon River and how it flows up over its banks and creates this incredible area of habitat that the fish can go swim around during that part of the year. That's an example of a wetland or a floodplain. Here in San Diego, we have a kind of very special habitat called vernal pools. And vernal refers to the springtime. We often talk about the vernal equinox. And what happens is there's sort of little indentations on the surface of the mesas, but the soil is pretty hard packed underneath them. And they form these little puddles or ponds during the winter when it rains. And then in the spring, because they're still moist, all of these highly specialized and adapted small plants grow in that temporary wetland. So they're an endangered type of habitat in San Diego just because of habitat loss. And there's all kinds of fascinating crustaceans that grow and live in them. They hatch out of eggs, they grow really fast, they get to sexual maturity in a couple of weeks, they mate, and then they die and the pond dries out, right, until the next year. All right. We look at marine habitats. When we are at the very edge of the ocean, we have this intertidal zone where they're sort of semi-terrestrial, semi-aquatic habitats, the tides going up and down. They're a really interesting but very stressful habitat, one of my favorite habitats. And where there's rocks, we have organisms stuck all over them. And we have just a fascinating diversity of a lot of different kinds of mollusks and crustaceans that live there. So the rocky intertidal zone is very rich in life, very diverse. Sandy beaches are somewhat less so. In temperate habitats, we tend to find more diversity in these nearshore habitats, as well as in tropical habitats. In temperate nearshore, we may have kelp forests. So right off the coast here, we have in areas that have the right amount of sort of wave motion and whatnot, we have these very large brown algae that form a forest-like environment, which sort of our version of a coral reef. They're biodiverse and they're productive ecosystems. We also have eelgrass meadows and salt marshes in our area. We'll come back to those. When we look out in the open ocean, it's actually pretty empty. You can, drive a boat across the ocean and you might see, if you're lucky, one whale jumping up. But the open ocean is going to just have these large pelagic animals. Often they aren't even feeding when they're out in this open ocean environment. They're actually feeding in Arctic nearshore habitats, only in the summer. We look at the deep sea floor. there's a lot of organisms that are scavengers, and they're really just kind of crawling around, slurping up the gunk that's laying on the bottom, chunks of like all the dead stuff that's fallen to the bottom. There's just these vast plains of this very fine mud and a whole pun of echinoderms and worms that live in the mud down there. We have these very special habitats, like I was talking about, these hydrothermal vents, where the water that's coming out from these cracks in the oceanic seafloor is very rich in these molecules that are high in energy, hydrogen sulfide, and the bacteria that live there are in symbiotic relationships with these organisms like tube worms, that basically they're feeding the tube worms, and these little islands of biodiversity are found right where these vents occur. All right, so in tropical nearshore habitats, we're going to find coral reefs. We're going to have mangrove swamps. Mangrove is a kind of tree that can actually live with its roots in salt water. So instead of having a marsh or an extensive plain with sort of grasses, we're going to have these trees forming these very dense swamp-like habitats. And where we have more sandy bottom habitats, the mangroves don't grow. We can also have these eelgrass meadows. So eelgrass is actually a flowering plant, and it grows kind of like a grassland. And we have large herbivores that graze, like these manatees, across these eelgrass meadows. They can also occur in temperate regions. All right, switching gears to terrestrial biomes. We're going to talk about a variety of types of forest, of grassland, desert, and habitats that also are desert-like because they're cold, they're dry, right? So we're sort of going to define those different habitats based on temperature and rainfall. And when we look across the entire globe, we see that these sort of tan areas of desert, they fall right across these regions of about 30 degrees latitude based on our atmospheric circulation patterns, that we have some places where we have a very high mountain range. You can see the Andes here in South America. You can see the Himalayas here between India and China. And in the United States and Mexico, we have these two mountain ranges. We have the Sierra Nevada, and we have the Rockies that go up into Canada. So these very high elevation habitats actually are quite similar to high latitude habitats, right? So high elevation are going to be similar to high latitude, right? So when we get very high up on the mountains, we're just going to have snow. When we get very high in the latitudes up towards the pole, we're just going to have snow. The way these plant communities are determined is that you need to have a lot of rain if you're going to grow a forest. Those large trees are going to have a lot of rainfall in order to support the amount of photosynthesis they need to do. And then if we look at rainfall and annual mean temperature, it allows us to find places on this graph, only these two variables. This is one of the things I really love about ecology. Remember, we're still in the ecology unit, is that we can look at patterns we see in the environment, and we can figure out why those patterns occur. And if we only have two variables, the amount of rainfall during the year and the temperature average during the year, and we can say whether we're going to be in desert or in forest, right? That's really powerful. All right, so the reason we're using annual temperature and annual rainfall is that we may have rainfall year round, or we may only have it in part of the year. So we want to add up a whole year so that we get the whole story of what's going on with the climate, the experience the plants have living there. Plants can't migrate away from a habitat in the winter, so they have to be able to survive the weather conditions. All right, so we see that at very low rainfalls, we have desert. At intermediate rainfalls, we have grassland. And at higher rainfalls, we have forest. That temperature is higher in deserts. Arctic and alpine tundra is a habitat that's kind of the equivalent to desert, but it's cold, right? Arctic is towards the poles, alpine is at the top of mountains. We're going to define different types of forests. We're going to have tropical rainforest that has a different kind of plants. Temperate broadleaf forest, that's the kind of forest that we think of that has the leaves that are green during the summer and turn pretty colors in the fall and fall off. And it's also called deciduous forest. And coniferous forest is made up of conifers or pinophyta, right? It's going to have those needle-like leaves. And these conifers actually evolved first in the history of the planet. And they are able to exist in more harsh conditions. They can stand colder winters than those broadleaf forests can. So they've been outcompeted and eliminated from the habitats that the broadleaf forests live in. And when we're going skiing and we're driving up the mountain and we go from, the coast where it's nice and pleasant, and then we start driving up the mountain and there's some forest and we go through it and then there's nothing left but pine trees, right? So when we get up to the area where the snow is, maybe a few, dead looking trees with no leaves on them, but the majority of the trees that are living at that elevation are pine trees. So we're going to see that as we go up mountains, we're going to have this same pattern of changes as we go down in temperatures across our different biomes. Right, so we have different types of forests, and the reason they're going to be different kinds of plants in those different areas is that these patterns of temperature. So forests need more rainfall than grasslands. We're going to find these evergreen or coniferous forests. They're called evergreen because they don't lose their leaves in the winter. In temperate regions where it is often rainy in the summer, but cold enough that it may snow in the winter, we're going to find these broadleaf or deciduous trees. And then in tropical rainforest, it's going to be very hot, very wet rainfall, order of magnitude higher than we have in our habitat area. And they're just going to be amazingly vibrantly green year round. Now, tropical regions may have a little seasonality. They may have a dry season and a rainy season, but it's still wetter in the dry season than it is most other places in their wet seasons. Grasslands are going to occur where there's less rainfall, but especially also where there's a big seasonal difference. And if they're warmer, they're tropical areas, they're going to be grassland. It's called savanna. And so when you're talking, when you're looking at some nature show about Africa and they say, oh, look, there's the lions out there on the savanna, that's just a fancy name for tropical grassland. It may have scattered trees. Part of the difference between whether an area is grassland or it's forest is also dependent on the large herbivores that live there. Elephants actually help maintain the grassland habitat because they tend to knock down trees and stomp on them and actually prevent them from overgrowing the grassland. So there can be some areas where these different biomes could exist, but because of the animals that live there or their history, they sort of have gone one way from one to the other. The grasses that live in these grasslands, they're very special plants because they're going to grow and keep growing. And even as animals are grazing them down, they're going to be able to keep growing. So they sort of just keep growing and animals can graze them down. A lot of plants, if they're eaten down from the top, they aren't going to be able to continue growing. So that's a special adaptation of grasses. Where we have drier habitats, our habitat here across the central region of San Diego. It's called chaparral or shrub land, and it occurs in a few specialized areas around the planet that are often referred to as Mediterranean climate. We have cool, wet winters, and we have warm, dry summers compared to these other biomes. It's a very pleasant place, pleasant habitat to live in. Not enough water for trees. And we find these other regions with similar habitat in South Africa, Southwestern Australia, and around the Mediterranean. So when we are looking at landscaping plants that we might plant around our houses, if they are not San Diego natives, they're probably from one of these other regions. And for example, lavender is from the Mediterranean and grows really well here. Ice plant is from South Africa. And there's all kinds of interesting plants from Australia that I can't think of one to name for you at this moment. All right, deserts are going to be hot during the day and dry. They may be very cold at night, but on average over the year, they're going to be hotter than other climates. So even though they get cold at night, don't let that throw you off. If we add up all of those hot days, and we're going to find those spread out across these 30-degree areas. Notice how few plants there are when we look at these landscapes. There's actually dirt, there's empty spaces in between the plants, right? So there's a whole lot fewer plants total that are able to live in these environments. All right, so the amount of rainfall, the temperature is mostly going to determine where what plants can grow there, and so what it's going to look like based on that pattern. So tundra is the last one that I forgot to say anything about. Tundra is it's a funny habitat. It's got plants that are growing there, but they tend to be very small. This looks like an enormous landscape, and who knows how big those plants could be. But if there was a caribou or a wolf standing here, these little plants would only stick up next to their feet. So it's cold. They may be frozen during most of the year. The soil may be in permafrost. It's relatively dry, even though there's going to be snowfall. There's not going to be much precipitation in terms of rain. And these tundra type of plants may be similar to plants that grow in less harsh circumstances, but they're going to be very small compared to those other plants. They just can't grow very big in those circumstances. To remember, if we go to high latitudes in the Arctic, we don't talk about an Antarctic biome because there's no continent down there. It's basically ice, whereas in the Arctic there is actually landmass that's up there in this latitude. But also in the alpine habitat. So when we go high enough in elevation, we do find this alpine tundra, and eventually we get to a place where no plants will grow because it's too cold during and dry during enough of the year. All right, so we say we're above the tree line, and even once we get above the tree line, all right, we may still find some of these tundra plants, but eventually we get to a place where there aren't any plants at all. So one of the things we're going to talk about in the in-person part of class is how are these different biomes affected by human caused changes. So when we think about these different habitats, we also want to think about what are the normal kinds of disturbances that these habitats might be evolved over long periods of time. For example, grasslands and shrublands are susceptible to burning. So the plants that live in those habitats are going to be adapted in some way to fire. However, when humans have changed the fire regime, right? So maybe we suppress fire for a long time, and then all this dry wood builds up, and then the forest really burns. Much more intensity over much larger areas. It may cause damage to the forest that a normal level of disturbance wouldn't cause. So when we were talking about disturbance and succession in the last ecology unit, we're going to have somewhat different patterns of how disturbance and succession work in each of these habitats. So say in the sea floor in the open ocean, there's hardly ever going to be a disturbance. It just doesn't happen there. However, in the rocky intertidal zone waves are crashing on it, storms come in, there's rocks, they get picked up, they get smashed down again. So there's going to be a lot of physical disturbance in those habitats. All right, so if we look at how humans are changing the habitats, we're also going to look at kind of what sort of species might be going extinct in these different habitats and why. So we want to think about the ways that humans are changing habitats. Habitat loss is the big thing that we're able to see, for example, on this map. So it's a map of land cover types, which is another way of saying biomes. And like I said, we can define these very big picture global biomes, but when we look in a smaller geographic area and we're botanists and we really care about these things, we can actually define slightly different versions of these biomes. All right, so we have these woody wetlands and they're different from evergreen shrub wetlands, right? So there's going to be characteristic species. So we can define even I think in San Diego, there's maybe 7 kinds of chaparral. If you really know your chaparral. So if we look at what's happened, this is the southern tip of Florida. And we have this incredibly large and fantastic, amazing region of the Everglades, this swampy area in the south sort of western tip. Miami's kind of off to the side of it on the coast. And we see this big region north of there, kind of in the middle of the peninsula, where all this yellow has changed. So we've changed from these darker green colors to yellow. So that's been conversion from whatever native habitat type to crops and mixed farming, so agriculture. Where we had forests and we've cut them down, we usually call that deforestation. That's one kind of habitat loss, where we have taken whatever habitat was there and we've turned it into a place where we're growing crops and we're farming. We've converted it to agriculture. The most obvious change that we make is urbanization, right? So we build cities and we build housing. And on this map, it's shown in gray, right? So this Miami area is this big urban gray blob on the east side. People are all living along the coast, along the beaches where it's nice. And then less of this concrete, city development when we go further inland. Oops, I didn't want to do that. All right, so when we think about what species might be going extinct or how these habitat changes might affect different species, we're going to see a lot of habitat loss and fragmentation, and we're going to see changes in the disturbance regimes that humans are making in these habitats as well. So we'll come back when we're talking in person and sort of make a grid of each of the different habitat types, the kind of disturbances that are normal, and things that humans are doing to change those habitats, kind of as a summary. All right, we will carry on with part 2 of the Earth lecture in a separate video.